Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. Everybody hear me okay? My first time in Holland. Just got here yesterday. I'm going to begin with a poem in English that you don't have copies of, that we're not projecting. So the other poems that I'm going to give you, I'm going to project so that you can follow along. It'll be easier. But this one I want you just to hear, and it's by a poet named A.R. Ammons. It's called The City Limits. When you consider the radiance, that it does not withhold itself, but pours its abundance without selection into every nook or cranny, not overhung or hidden. When you consider that birds' bones make no awful noise against the light, but lie low in the light as in a high testimony. When you consider the radiance, that it will look into the guiltiest swervings of the weaving heart and bear itself upon them, not flinching into disguise or darkening. When you consider the abundance of such resource as illuminates the glow blue bodies and gold skeined wings of flies swarming the dumped guts of the natural slaughter or the coil of shit, and in no way winces from its storms of generosity, when you consider that air or vacuum, snow or shale, squid or wolf, rose or lichen, each is accepted into as much light as it will take. Then the heart moves roomier. The man stands and looks about. The leaf does not increase itself above the grass. And the dark work of the deepest cell is of a tune with May bushes and fear, lit by the breath of such, calmly turns to praise. And fear, lit by the breath of such, calmly turns to praise. That's A.R. Ammons, a great American poet from North Carolina originally. And I begin with it for a couple of reasons. One is because I like to begin with a poem that's memorized. You hear it differently if you are not hearing something that's read, if you hear something that's recited. I also begin with it because I'm going to talk about art and faith, particularly Christianity, and the word art is like the word faith, in that if you use it abstractly for very long, it just becomes completely devoid of meaning. And so I want to foreground a poem. And the last reason that I begin with that poem in particular is that although it feels like it's a religious poem, when you consider the radiance that it does not withhold itself but pours its abundance, etc., feels like it could even be a Christian poem, an incarnational poem. The fact is, Ammons had no religious belief at all. And in fact, he could be really fierce about Christianity. And so that's another thing that I want to talk about here and probably the rest of the afternoon, is what an art of faith looks like in the apparent absence of faith, and what an art created by someone who has no faith might have to say to people who do have faith. Ammons, his stance is kind of familiar at this point. He's an unbelieving believer. He wouldn't really believe in anything at all beyond the material world that's right in front of him if it weren't for these insights that he's given in his own life and in poetry. And yet, by means of these insights, William Wordsworth, the great English poet, called them spots of time. By means of these insights, it becomes possible to live, and in Ammons' case, even to praise. The great Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel once described faith as being mostly faithfulness to the times when we had faith, which is, I think, a very helpful definition. We remember these moments of intensity and closeness to God, and we endeavor to remain true to them. It's a tenuous and tenacious discipline of memory and hope. There are theologians who have seen their practice similarly. Karl Barth says, theology knows the light which is intrinsically perfect and reveals everything in a flash, yet it knows it only in the prism of this act, which however radically it may be understood is still a human act. And then Barth goes on to talk about how limited this act is and how distinct theology is, all theology is, from divine revelation. Most poets that I know, most artists that I know would not draw that distinction. The inspiration that you're given in a work of art is revelation in the Barthian sense. And you're going to burn in hell, figuratively speaking, if you don't trust it. There are exceptions. Franz Kafka, in one of a famous letter that he wrote after writing all through the night, wrote a letter in the morning in which he said, I have finally discovered what all these blissful hours of work really are, the reward for serving the devil. This puts a little different spin on the old inspiration as the voice of God. Anyway, Christianity and art. These are subjects that I don't seem to stop thinking about because I do call myself a Christian and my whole life has been defined trying to be an artist. You may have your doubts about both by the time we're through with the day, but the great paradox of art for the artist is that the very art in which he feels experience most intensely can actually require a severe detachment from experience. Perfection of the life or perfection of the work, as the great Irish poet W.B. Yeats put it. If that fiery beauty Maud Gunn had only reciprocated his passion, he was very much in love with this woman Maud Gunn, her ambitions were all political, and she wasn't so interested in Yeats. And he thought, if she had only turned to him in those years when he was trying to become an artist, then he might have, as he says, I might have thrown poor words away and been content to live. The point is, you got to choose. The tension between art and life or imagination and experience can be particularly rending when you think about religious artists. There are famous examples from poetry, Gerard Manley Hopkins and George Herbert from English poets. Hopkins was a Catholic priest who actually renounced poetry for 7 years. His reason was that he thought poetry wasn't consistent with the seriousness of his vocation, but you don't have to read a lot of Hopkins before you realize that the real reason was that he thought that the intensity of his aesthetic experience competed with the intensity of his religious experience, and he felt like he had to make a choice. Herbert was a contemporary of Shakespeare. He wrestled with the same thing. He was also a priest, but an Anglican priest, and not until later in his life. He had political ambitions, and he had swerved from those after they were disappointed into a career in parish ministry. And when he was 37, he got married, and he very happily married, and he became a parish priest. And he began to die of tuberculosis all at the same time. And a lot of his most famous poems, scholars think, were written in this time. The trouble for him was all of Herbert's poems were religious, but he felt that there was some anarchic element and energy at the heart of making art that he couldn't control and which he had to subdue in order to serve God. And so you can feel that tension in his poem, all the way through his poems, even in some that aren't about art. There's one here. Ah, my dear angry Lord, since thou dost love, yet strike, cast down, yet help afford, sure I will do the like, the same. I will complain, yet praise. I will bewail, weep, approve. And all my sour, sweet days I will lament and love. W.H. Otten once called poetry the clear expression of mixed feelings. It's a great definition, the clear expression of mixed feelings. It's why poetry, I would argue, of some sort, is so essential to any unified religious life, and why the bastardizations of the Bible that erase the poetry for the sake of clarity are such a travesty. The clear expression of mixed feelings. What could be more necessary for the modern muddle of religious experience than poetry? And all my sour, sweet days I will lament and love at the same damn time. Let me turn to a couple of my own poems. I'm going to use my own experience as a lens through which to look at these issues. The next one is Pusztolka. Anyway, I lived in Prague the year after the Velvet Revolution, And I lived with someone at the time, and we lived in one of those grim, gray apartment blocks that surround so many Eastern European cities, paniloks, they're called in Czech. We lived on the 7th floor. We paid $30 a month, 30 American dollars a month for this apartment in Prague. It was a grim apartment, but we lived on the 7th floor, so we had a view of Prague, so it was quite romantic place to live. And one time when I was studying Czech at the table, my girlfriend was in the bath. This falcon, kestrel, landed on the windowsill. I think Willem Jan is going to translate this poem later, read a translation of this poem. But it landed right on the windowsill, and it was literally, 3-4 feet from me. And a decade later, it takes me a long time for these things to work through in my mind. A decade later, I wrote this poem, which is called Poštolka, which in Czech means falcon, or maybe kestrel. When I was learning words, and you were in the bath, there was a flurry of small birds. And in the aftermath of all that panicked flight, as if the red dusk willed a concentration of its light, a falcon on the sill. It scanned the orchard's bowers, then pane by pane it eyed the stories facing ours, but never looked inside. I called you in to see, and when you'd steamed the room and naked next to me stood dripping as a bloom of blood formed in your cheek and slowly seemed to melt, I could almost speak the love I almost felt. Wish for something, you said. A shiver pricked my spine. The falcon turned its head and locked its eyes on mine, and for a long moment I'm still in. I wished and wished and wished the moment would not end. And just like that, it vanished. That's a love poem by someone who's not really capable of love. It's a rapture of time by someone who never quite enters time. A celebration of life by a man whose mind is tuned only to elegies. It is also, I think, in a very peculiar and modern sense, a devotional poem, or at least an unconscious attempt at a devotional poem, though God is nowhere present within it. That may be the thing that makes it modern. I was raised in a very religious atmosphere. Some of you already know. It was in far west Texas, a little town called Snyder, very small. And everyone I knew went to church, quite unlike Amsterdam, I see. Everyone I knew went to church, and I actually have no memory of meeting an atheist, a single one, until I went off to college in Virginia. And when I met that person, he might have swiveled around his head and began growling at me in Aramaic or something. It wouldn't have surprised me more than simply to hear someone announce their atheism. My faith fell away, or it seemed to, under the pressure of the books that I began to read. And for a long time I lived apart from God, and not simply apart from God, but as that poem Poštolka reveals, apart from the world. Like many modern artists, the energy in my art seemed to come from this very distance. That the energy was often a despairing one, that just seemed to me what modern art was. I wasn't an atheist, not really. I was deeply interested in theology in my 20s. I was more someone fiercely devoted to his lack of faith, or fiercely devoted to a faith that had no object at all, either in this world or in any other. Sumptuous destitution is how the great American poet Emily Dickinson defines it. Sumptuous, rich, luxurious destitution, absence, emptiness. Without my loneliness, I would be more lonely, wrote Marianne Moore, so I keep it. It took some serious events to shatter my notions of myself and my art. I think most of you in this room are familiar with most of those events, so I'm not going to go into them. Here's the short version. Poetry had been the main focus of my adult life. I arranged everything in my life to make space for becoming a poet, for writing poems. And at some point in my mid-30s, it went dead for me for 3 years. And I became completely unable to write a word. In that same time, I fell in love in a way that I knew immediately was both primal and permanent. And I got a terrible diagnosis that demanded some radical changes in the way that I was living. All of these experiences were, I think, one experience. But it took me a long time, again, to get it through my thick head. And the experience was the call of God. Here's another poem called From a Window. So this was written sometime after all of these experiences that I've related, and it was written in one very quick, consuming burst, all at once, in the way that a work of art can come so that it seems almost like you can't claim credit for it, it just happens. This is a man sitting in a room looking out a window and a flock of birds takes off from a tree. It's that simple. Incurable and unbelieving in any truth but the truth of grieving. I saw a tree inside a tree rise kaleidoscopically as if the leaves had livelier ghosts. I pressed my face as close to the pain as I could get to watch that fitful, fluent spirit that seemed a single being, undefined, or countless beings of one mind, haul its strange cohesion beyond the limits of my vision, over the house, heavenwards. Of course I knew those leaves were birds. Of course that old tree stood exactly as it had and would. But why should it seem fuller now? And though a man's mind might endow even a tree with some excess of life to which a man seems witness, that life is not the life of men. And that is where the joy came in. Nothing in that poem was planned. I didn't begin to have the realization that an experience of reality can open up into an experience of God and then sit down to write a poem that illustrated my feelings. It was quite the opposite. I started the poem one day out of anguish, emptiness, destitution, despair, all of the things that had animated my earlier work, and the poem exploded into joy. Here's another one. For D. D is my wife. This is one time I saw a tree that a young tree had partially cracked and fallen into another one, so it was being supported by another tree, and it had stayed alive that way because it hadn't completely fallen, and I don't know how long it would have stayed alive, but it was alive. Groans going all the way up a young tree, half cracked and caught in the crook of another. Pause. All around the hill-ringed, heavened pond, leaves shush themselves like an audience. A cellular stillness, as of some huge attention bearing down. May I hold your hand? A clutch of mayflies, banqueting on oblivion, writhes above the water like visible light. I imagine we have all had moments like this in one form or another. Moments when all of the vacant interstellar spaces and random atoms seem to perceive each of us, right down to the very last cell of our singularity. One of those moments when oblivion whispers in our ears, when it seems in fact not oblivion. If by oblivion we mean only an end to everything that we know and love and are. You could call it God. You could call it being or mind in some utterly de-individualized capacity. Or you might not want to call it anything at all. Both these poems were real breakthroughs for me. Radical influxes of life beyond my own, and they felt altogether different from the work that I had done earlier. And that's why in the months and in the years that followed, some of the poems that I wrote after these were very disturbing to me because they seemed to emerge from the same tangle of anguish, joy, and yet they ended up in quite different places. Have a look at this one. It is good to sit even a rotting body in sunlight uncompromised by God or lack of God. To see the bee beyond all the plundered flowers ere stagger toward you and like a delicate helicopter hover above your knee until it finds you to be not sweet but at least not flinching. Its hair legs on the hair of your leg, silvering a coolness through you like a soul of nerve. Or this one. This is a man on a roof after some sort of storm has come, and he is attempting to fix someone. It begins in medias res, in the middle of things, and you can tell that there's an argument that's been going on between someone on the ground or at another part of the house and this person on the roof, and what they're arguing about is the point of God in the midst of suffering. There is no consolation in the thought of God, he said, slamming another nail in another house, another havoc had half taken. Grace is not consciousness, nor is it beyond. To hell with remembrance, to hell with heaven. Hammer is the prayer of the poor and the dying. And as wind in some lordless random comes to rest, and all the disquieted dust within, peace came to the hinterlands of our minds, too remote to know, but peace nonetheless. Not only is there no God in these poems, but the very possibility of God is pushed roughly to the side. And yet the weird thing is, I felt God everywhere in me and around me when I wrote them. There is no possibility of heaven in these poems. Indeed, there is open contempt for the notion. And yet I felt, during that brief marriage of word and world that poetry is, projected into dimensions of existence that I could not have imagined before writing the poems. Can there be such a thing as an anti-devotional poem? As a prayer to God that also seems aimed at God like a weapon. Hopkins and Herbert both felt that God circumscribed imagination, that faith required that they draw certain lines inside of their own minds which they dare not cross. I understand the dilemma, but I disagree with the solution. If faith requires you to foreclose on an inspiration, I'm not sure that it is faith. I don't see any of these poems that I've recited today in simple opposition to each other. I'm convinced that the same impulse that leads me to sing of God at other moments leads me to sing of godlessness. God would have us know that we must live as men who manage our lives without Him, says Dietrich Bonhoeffer in a letter from prison. And then he goes on, the famous words, the God who lets us live in the world without the working hypothesis of God is the God before whom we stand continually. Before God and with God, we live without God. Clearly then the question of which art is seeking God and seeking to be in the service of God is more complicated than it might seem. There is something in all original art that will not be made subject to God. If we mean by being made subject to God a kind of voluntary censorship or willed refusal of the mind's spontaneous and sometimes disturbing intrusions into reality. But that is not how I've come to understand that phrase. In fact, we come closer to the truths of the artist's relation to divinity, not of being made subject to God, but of being subjected to God. Our individual subjectivity lost and rediscovered within the reality of God. God's truth is life, says the poet Patrick Kavanagh, even the grotesque shapes of its foulest fire. One part of that truth, for even the most devout among us, is the void of godlessness. And, this is the really strange part, the joy of that void. The joy of being momentarily released from the burden of seeking and making meaning. What I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that sometimes God might call a person to unbelief in order that faith can take new forms. Let me end with one poem that might show how some of these issues have played out for me in recent years. I wrote it during one long, difficult night when my thoughts were all a case of knives, to quote George Herbert again. My thoughts are all a case of knives. There's a lot of background context to the poem, but I don't need to fill it in too much. Context ought to get burned away from good poems, but also this particular context nearly burned me away. And I'd still find the memories smoldering a bit. I was sick unto death in the Kierkegaardian sense, sick in my soul, but also quite literally. It has been my experience that the reason why there are no atheists in foxholes, as they say, of course there are, but you know the phrase, is not because of the roar of death and destruction that makes a person terrified, but because when one is truly confronted with one's own death, everything goes icily quiet. You don't turn to God in a crisis because you're afraid, at least not primarily. You turn to God because for once all that background chatter in your brain, all that pandemonium of blab that goes on all the time in our heads, ceases, and you can hear. And what some of us hear in that moment is a still, small voice. I've never felt much comfort in the notion of heaven or eternity, mostly because I can't conceive of it. Christianity is, or at least it ought to be, a scouring of the self, of the individual ego. And most of our notions of eternity and heaven amount to nothing more than a dream of the self's survival. This is what the critics of faith have said for years, that religion amounts to nothing more than a refusal to face our deaths. They have a strong point. And yet, something in us does seem unkillable at times. We have those moments of banqueting on oblivion. We have our intimations of immortality, as William Wordsworth called them. In art, in love, in life, moments when we momentarily cease to be ourselves and become paradoxically more ourselves, our souls. Here's one of my moments of soul then. It occurs not in some bucolic place like the Lake District, which is where William Wordsworth was from, but on the dirty, overcrowded L line in central Chicago. You know, you've been in, the L is what we call a train in Chicago because it's the elevated train. For a while I worked at Poetry Magazine, which is downtown, very old magazine of English poetry, American poetry, and our offices were at a stop called Grand. Okay, so that's the station Grand. It's mentioned in the poem. There is another station mentioned in the poem called Clark and Division. It's just another station, another stop. This poem is simply, everyone's crowded onto this L line. It's a miserable, hot, everyone's furious. Maybe I was projecting that on them, but it seemed to me everyone was. And there was a moment when the train cast up a fantail of sparks, like you'll see sometimes. This was truly an extravagant one. And it seemed to me that everyone turned and looked at it at the same time. Imaginary, no doubt, but that's what happened in the poem. The poem is about what might happen after we die. And the poem is about Jesus Christ, too, though again, nowhere mentioned. I have no illusion, some fusion of force and form will save me. Bewilderment of bone light ungrave me. As when the L shooting through a hell of ratty alleys where nothing thrives but soot and the rat-like lives that have learned to eat it, screechingly peacocked a grace of sparks so far out and above the fast curve that jostled and fastened us into a single shock of, I will not call it love, but at least some brief and no doubt illusionary belief that in some surge of brain we were all seeing one thing, a lone, unearned loveliness struck from an iron pane. Already it was gone. Already it was bone, the gray sky and the encroaching skyline pecked so clean by raptor night, I shuddered at the cold gleam we hurtled toward like some insentient herd plunging underground at Clark and Division. And yet all that day I had a kind of vision that's never gone completely away, of immense, clear-paned towers and endlessly expendable hours through which I walked teeming human streets, filled with a shine that was most intimately me and not mine. Thank you all.